Welcome to our third panel of the conference, something we haven't talked about at all this week, beauty and contemporary art. A totally new, non-controversial, untested topic. So we'll see how it goes, but I'm looking forward to hearing what all of our panelists have to say. So we're going to start here on my left with Jonathan Anderson, who is an artist and art critic. He teaches at Biola University, lives in LA, and is the author of, wait for it, it's a long one, Modern Art and the Life of a Culture, The Religious Impulses of Modernism. So, yes. Did I get that right?
Yeah.
There are no other words? Okay.
No. There's a subtitle.
Oh.
Yeah.
And then next to him will be Linnea Spancy, who is a working artist in LA, who is the co-director of Water Table Artists Trust, followed by John Henry Crosby, whom I think you all might have met, the founder and president of the Hildebrand Project. And then on the end, Rebecca Bratten Weiss will be joining us again, who is an editor of Convivium, and she teaches literature here and writes poetry and novels. So with that, we will begin with Jonathan.
All right. So I'm an artist, art critic, who works primarily in the field of modern and contemporary art, writing about it, teaching about it, and so forth. And beauty occupies a notoriously difficult position in that field, in those fields. For a whole slew of reasons, beauty very much came under pressure as a functional category in modernism, and I think for good reason. But I think there is space for much richer thinking about beauty in modern and contemporary art that is going on in lots of areas and realms of contemporary art making and writing. And I want to explore that a little bit with you today. On the one hand, I could approach this as a kind of celebratory talk. Choose all of the instances of contemporary artists who are making fantastically beautiful work and sort of celebrate that. But that would sort of ignore some of the deeper challenges that are in play and going on. So I want to see if I can try to confront some difficulties, challenges, using von Hildebrand as a kind of jumping off point. But see if I can argue and show that actually beauty is very much at stake and very much in play in contemporary art making. Okay? Is that all right? Okay. Let me see if I can check some notes here. So one of the reasons that, and I won't go into this for sake of time, but maybe it can come up if it needs to later. One of the reasons that beauty was in some ways removed from the modern art discourse, contemporary art discourse, not entirely, but to a great extent. One of the reasons for that wasn't just to attack beauty. It often had to do with displacing beauty as a sufficient or necessary condition of art. And ultimately, I think that's the right argument. Art at its core is not about being beautiful, but about being meaningful. And beauty is deeply meaningful to us, but it's not the only kind of criteria for meaningfulness in the arts. And I think this is where von Hildebrand and modernism sort of come into direct conflict. In chapter 12, I mean, it's sort of all over von Hildebrand's aesthetics, but in chapter 12, well, no, even before that, he argues that beauty is thematic in art. It's the raison d'etre of art, great art. And in chapter 12, he goes on to argue for the antitheses of beauty, and thus the antitheses to that which is thematic in art, or should be. And he names those antitheses, those three major antitheses, as ugliness, triviality, and boringness. The ugly, the trivial, and the boring. And for those of you who know modern and contemporary art, actually those are really those are three really important themes. Right? That artists explore the ugly in the 20th century and 21st for that matter. They explore the trivial and they explore the boring as realms of potentially expansive human meaning. And that might seem counterintuitive to you, but we'll see if we can sort that out. I'll see if I can explore that a bit more. And even if those come into conflict with, or if modern art comes into conflict with von Hildebrand on those points a bit, I think we can still use von Hildebrand to argue that much of what is at stake in some of these artists is maybe not beauty of the first power, but I think artists very much care about beauty of the second power, or of even metaphysical beauty that might be located and somehow experienced in the ugly, the trivial, and the boring. Okay, let's see if we can sort that out a little bit. I want to run through a few artists here, and I'll try to do so efficiently and quickly. I'm going to start with John Cage. So this is one of his notorious, infamous works. It is 4 minutes and 33 seconds. This work, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, consisted of a performance in which a renowned, very well-respected pianist comes out onto the stage, sits at the piano, and begins the first movement, it's in 3 movements, begins the first movement by closing the keyboard and depressing one of the pedals and letting 30 seconds of silence go by. And then that first movement ends, he opens the keyboard, the second movement begins by closing the keyboard, depressing the second of the pedals, once again to activate the piano. He's playing the piano, he's activating. And then 2 minutes and 23 seconds of rest, musical rest goes by. And then third movement, we do it again for another minute and 40 seconds, ultimately going for 4 minutes and 33 seconds. Now, of course, this was scandalous, audacious. John Cage says of the work, "I knew it would be taken as a joke. I knew it would be taken as a renunciation of work, of labor, of skill. Whereas I also knew that if it was done, it would be the highest form of artwork. I've never gratuitously done anything for shock, though what I have found necessary to do I have carried out occasionally and only after struggles of conscience, even if it involved actions apparently outside the boundaries of art." This work wasn't just performed anywhere, and I think it can be performed anywhere, but it's more profitable in some places than others. It was first performed here, and this is really important. It's the Maverick Concert Hall. The idea of the work was that if you gather people, a group of people who are expectant to hear meaningful sound, that they're bringing with them sort of the hermeneutics of art, that what we're going to get is not just sound or noise, but meaningful sound. And if you take that kind of orientation and you withhold the one thing they're expecting to hear, what is left? And for Cage, what his real interest was could we take that kind of interpretive attentiveness and hear the world around us as musical, as meaningful sound, not as chaos, not as just mere happenstance, or I suppose it is happenstance, but meaningful happenstance. And so the work is for art for Cage. His definition of art is, here's quote, "Art is a means of converting the mind, turning it around so that it moves away from itself out to the rest of the world. Art is, according to him, a purposeful play, an affirmation of life, not an attempt to bring order out of chaos, nor even to suggest improvements in creation, but a way of waking us up to the very life we're living, which is so excellent once one gets one's mind and one's desires out of its way and lets it act of its own accord. And I would add, with its own fullness of meaning. And so for Cage, the idea, I think, ultimately, is that this work is not supposed to be contained to the concert hall. In fact, you're supposed to go through your life. He would say, I practice 4 minutes and 33 seconds every day of my life, and it's one of the chief sources of joy in my life. I hear the world as very beautiful and full of meaning by just turning my attention to it. For Cage, there is a deep beauty, not here obviously in the what the strings of the piano are doing, though he would affirm that's important too. This is one work, it's not every work. But he would say that there's extraordinary beauty in attending to the sheer gratuitous givenness of the world. There's an ontological beauty that is coursing through everything, and it is us who turn away from it. And it's us who turn toward it and open ourselves to it. That's ultimately the, I think, point of that Cage is making. So it was scandalous and, yes, maybe not entirely charitable to his audience because he didn't frame it in any way. But I think a rich and important work. I practice this with some of my students. We perform it. And it's amazing to me how and we do it outside, which is where you're supposed to do it, I think. It's amazing to me how deeply moved they are by experiencing it. So actually, if any of you are interested, maybe before dinner, if you want to practice, perform, you have to perform 4 minutes and 33 seconds with me, I'll meet you outside and we'll do it out on the lawn.
No musical talent required.
Just musical love and attentiveness. You might have to have a special organ, as von Hildebrand would say. Waking us up to the life we're living. So I've used up all my time, so I'm going to blast through just a couple of other artists because that's the 50s. There are a lot of artists who are really interested in beauty and interested in turning us toward the world, toward the lives we're living, and finding great beauty in it. One of them is James Turrell. I won't talk through this so much, but essentially it's a kind of a space that you go into at sunset or sunrise sometimes, and he simply recontextualizes the color through which you're looking at the sky. And by changing the context of the color, he causes the color to shift around a lot. He can make the same color of sky during the sunset look mint, gray, green, and pink. It's extraordinary how malleable color is and how wonderful it is. Color is a relational property. And he gets us looking at the sky. I can never look at the sky again after being in a James Turrell. I want to talk just really briefly about the trivial, maybe even the ugly, in addition to the boring, which is, John Cage, presumably. This is an artist named Elanat Sui. He's a Nigerian, Ghanaian born, but Nigerian. He lives in Nigeria. And he makes these vast tapestries out of caps from aluminum liquor bottles. Aluminum liquor caps. And he knits them together into these massive kind of kente cloths. For him, this not only speaks about, mass alcoholism, probably, but also alcohol, liquor, specifically. He's not using beer or something like that, wine. Liquor in Africa has a deep connection to slavery. Lots of the slave trade throughout the centuries were traded in liquor because it was a sort of universal currency. And so you put those together, a kind of mass alcoholism perhaps, but also a slave trade There's extraordinary pain and suffering inscribed in these materials, and he's taking them up and knitting them together. I think there's a real ugliness at stake here, and there's real beauty at stake here. This is a close-up. I'll show you one more artist because I'm out of time. Speaking of ugliness and horror, Dora Salcedo's a Colombian artist, brilliant, wonderful, look up all of her work. She's deeply interested in the ugly and the trivial and the horrifying, really. She makes work about the Civil War, Colombian Civil War, and the disappeared. Much of her work is devoted to those who were disappeared during the fighting, the struggles. This one is specifically devoted to, or kind of taking off of, a nurse who was giving very generously of herself and who was abducted and tortured, and her body was never recovered. And so Salcedo makes for her this shroud that represents not only her, but the thousands of others. And it is made up entirely of rose petals that have been preserved and then sutured together, stitches, sutures. It's incredibly fragile. You can't really touch it without tearing it. It's this deeply painful veil, shroud even, that lays on the floor, binding together all of these tragic and ugly stories into trivial and easily overlooked materials, and she stitches them together in a loving way that I think maybe redeems the story. There's a deep beauty at stake, even if it's not just entirely in the materials themselves. It might be in the overall activity of the work. Okay, I'm totally out of time. Thank you very much.
I haven't been privy to the whole conversation, so I don't have shared vocabulary with everyone right now, but I'm going to conduct a little bit of an experiment, and instead of pulling in a bunch of other artists that I think deal with beauty in a contemporary way, I'm going to actually put myself out there. Because I had an experience myself that caused a flip from more conventionally beautiful work that I myself was making in the studio towards a more mysterious and perhaps more difficult to access sort of practice publicly. And this happened for me in grad school, and it's connected also with a testimony of recommitting my life to one of faith. And so it might be a little bit contrarian for some of you and what you think about beauty, but for me it was a deeply moving and personal transition from one to the other. So I was trained classically, and I'm going to show you some examples of that. Do I push this button on the right? Okay. All the classic means of training were rigorously applied in my life, and I did an anatomy and even dissected cadavers and really enjoyed the human form. And these pieces are not necessarily old, but they're emblematic of the work that I did in school, and I went to my entire schooling based off the strength of this work, grants, all that kind of stuff, went to Yale. And nevertheless, and these are just examples, contemporary examples, I still practice this quietly on my own. This is not my public work. I have a little kind of diuretic tendency where I take the people that are meaningful in my life and I record them personally. I sit across the table from them and draw them. So these pieces are new. But so are these pieces. And this is my public work, essentially. And I'm going to explain why this work potentially is freighted with more meaning. Even though it is abstract, it is very carefully made, and it is made in a way that is potentially boring to some people, but it accumulates towards something. And when I was in school, actually, let's go back to this for a second. I came to this moment where I realized that the faith that I came from, a family of faith, and that faith had to transition into a contemporary moment. And the moment is one where, especially in grad school, there's this pervasive idea that really the main outlines of reality are determined by science and the scientific method. And any other way of determining what's real and verifiable is not as solid because it can't be repeated with the scientific method. And I started to really realize that that was such a narrow way to define reality, and that science itself was fetching up for us all kinds of conundrums and fraying at the edges in really interesting ways. So I started to study quantum physics and become really interested in when systems sort of accumulate to levels of kind of erratic behavior, right? And that a certain set of similarity or of certainties don't necessarily mean that you're always going to arrive at the same results repeatedly and repeatedly and repeatedly. And that started to be true in science, especially in quantum physics. So I started to realize this was linked to matters of free will. And I also started to realize there wasn't anyone exploring this visually and kind of creating a language to explore these sorts of things. So I decided I would try it. Artists are willing to experiment with their own labor and really challenge themselves. Though they may have many skills, those skills aren't freighted with meaning unless you challenge those skills to inventiveness, essentially. So I started realizing I wanted to make work that was based off systems that were very clearly defined, and to box in my practice with some very severe internal regulations. So all of my works are based off of modules that can be linked together according to very simple rules. And all those rules are based off of root numbers that multiply in very basic ways. This is an example of groups of 10 multiplying and then traveling up a spine. And I determine all the numbers and the ways that the whole system will grow and when it will terminate. So there's no uncertainty, apparently, when I start. So before I begin, I understand all the steps that I'm going to take, but I won't know what I'm going to make unless I commit the labor and I take the risk and I do it. And in some cases, pieces take months and months to finish. And I won't know if the thing will collapse in on itself or grow into something worth looking at. This is a drawing of that system. Here are details. I started using frosted mylar, which you saw in that first slide, because I could stack information infinitely. Well, perhaps not infinitely because I'm a mortal. But it can grow in space in all directions. And those pieces I never consider finished. They're always just paused. And it's a matter of me pouring in more energy to see what it'll do and where it will go. This is a painting that's about 8 feet tall, and it's a very simple example of one of these systems played out. And it's sort of an impossible object. And the system is built on a grid that's random, and it loops back on itself according to very simple rules. When I finished it, I realized that it was basically a very large Moebius strip. So it folds in on itself. It's one of those kind of eternal loops. This is another very large painting that's a favorite of someone in the room. And it's a series of ribbons that have one difference on each side, and only one, and it starts to behave. If I did another iteration of it, it would start to fly apart. I'd have to explain each one to you, and it would take far too long than 8 minutes, but rest assured, each one is a series of very strict limitations on myself. And it's a game played between the tension of certainty and the potential for discovery. And that seems to me a really important thing to emphasize in this moment when there tends to be a triumphal note around this idea that the certainty of science will save us from all dynamics beyond our control. And that kind of fallacy is really something that I wanted to experience myself in the studio. I wanted to experience the contradiction of that, how there is a beautiful, very productive space between certainty and uncertainty, but you have to commit labor to it. And that's an element of where that boredom comes in. And for me, it became a really strong parallel to a life of faith. And it gives dignity to the boredom of simply seeing a thing through. So I put myself and my work out there as perhaps, in a humble way, an example of supporting some of the things that actually Jonathan was saying. That in the end you can wind up with something quite beautiful if you pursue meaning even through uncertainty and ugliness and boredom. There is perhaps on the other side of it strange new lands. And in my case, though I was formally trained and I know a tremendous amount about the proper way to make a painting, I submit all of that to the concept. And the concept pulls me into new formal territory I would never otherwise voluntarily explore. So, I've given you a lot of things to look at. Believe me, there's more. And I did some performances as well. Oh, these are the larger pieces. I did some performances as well with a friend of mine, but I think I've run out of time, so I'm not going to describe them to you. But they are about accumulation and commitment to simple ideas that can result in richness. And I would go so far as to say that beauty can be, oftentimes beauty, if it's directly aimed at, is devoid of meaning. But if you aim towards meaning, beauty can be a kind of cloak that ends up ennobling that drive towards meaning. So, but it can be surprising. There we go.
My first thought, as I was watching all of the images that you were putting up, was that they're really not boring, trivial, or ugly in Hildebrand's sense. I think that there's this isn't really what I want to talk about, but I just want to say that I think that what he has in mind are instances where, for example, regarding the trivial, where a certain aesthetic vocabulary has spent itself so much that it struggles to say anything anymore. And it's boring for a very different reason. That's totally different than sort of recognizing boredom as a feature of human experience, or maybe part of the commitment to completing a process and then making that part of an aesthetic quest. So, though I wouldn't say that I can't speak for Van Hildebrand, he's in another place, no doubt it's better than where we are, I hope. And I hope there's a lot of beauty there and meaning, but my instinct in any case is that what you're showing in the kind of art that consciously seeks to work within a contemporary idiom, or that wrestles with problems and questions as you define them, can still work within that overall scope. That's not to say that his aesthetics, or the aesthetics of von Balthasar or others that have this root in the tradition where beauty is indeed understood to be thematic, is that it's entirely compatible. But I don't hear his objections to the beauty, to the ugly, the trivial, and so on, as really applying also to the examples that you had. I think if anything, certainly I think those of us who look to him for inspiration can imagine that some of this higher order beauty that he's trying to point his finger to, or even the kind of mystery when one juxtaposes, or even when one just frontally confronts ugliness, but does it in a meaningful way, that the emergent beauty from that could really be very much in that second order sense. So that's just my initial reaction. And I think it's, I was very impressed with what you had to show. So thank you. I wanted to just briefly bring into our conversation about beauty and contemporary art this theme of kitsch, which Roger Scruton analyzes. And I don't want to really take Scruton's side in everything. He's very traditionally minded on many things. I don't know how far his willingness would go to find a contemporary vocabulary, but he puts his finger on at least one significant reason for which beauty ceased to be a sufficient and necessary condition, as Jonathan put it, for art created with real authenticity, genuineness, truth. Kitsch, as he understands it, is a kind of falsification of emotion. It's art that is designed to generate a reaction in a person, and he has this idea that it's ultimately a kind of emotional shortcut to significant experiences. No spiritual discipline required. You can look at, he identifies the origins of kitsch actually in 19th century religious practices, devotional practices. One can look at the kitschy Madonna or crucifix and be elevated in a way which doesn't really require any painful acknowledgement of one's own sinfulness or of the journey required to receiving redemption, the gift of faith, and so on. And then, of course, he thinks that he also makes the interesting observation that kitsch requires also a kind of knowing complicity. I don't think everyone knows about the complicity, but there's this sort of understanding in general that we're playing along, that he says, kitsch is pretense, but not all pretense is kitsch. Something else is needed to create the sense of intrusion, the unwanted hand on the knee. Kitsch is not just pretending, it is asking you to join the game. In real kitsch, what is being faked cannot be faked. Hence, the pretense must be mutual, complicitous knowing. In other words, one can't really fake these emotions. One isn't really satisfied by much of this religious art, but one sort of goes along with it and plays the part. The argument that he makes, he cites the famous essay of Clement Greenberg on avant-garde and kitsch, in which Greenberg said figurative painting is dead. The great famous line was, the alternative to abstraction is not Michelangelo but kitsch. And in Scruton's reading anyway, this sort of sets the agenda for modern art, modernist art. And then he says a lot of other very interesting things that I'm not personally, I wouldn't want to judge on a panel with real experts. But the idea is that kitsch becomes a kind of infection. He speaks of the kitsch fly laying its eggs, very awful image. But the idea is that also he points out that even in cultures that had been free of kitsch, so when Picasso and Bartók and and Stravinsky and others are looking for authentic expressions particularly in indigenous cultures, there was no kitsch there. Scruton says that kitsch is definitely a post-Enlightenment phenomenon, but once the import process begins, he says you can buy kitsch on every street corner in Africa, and what's imported back. And he says it's always in the smallest details. It's the false imitation of authentic forms. Just to leave you with a final thought, the way Scruton interprets the source of kitsch is that he says that he calls it a suggestion, and he derives it from ethics. And I'll just sort of summarize it and read a few expressive lines and bring my remarks to a conclusion. And let me just say that the reason I'm proposing this idea of kitsch is because I think that if kitsch is really what it is, and I think most of us can see it, I think of the famous definition of pornography by the Supreme Court Justice, I'm forgetting who it was, who said, we can't define it, but we all know it when we see it. Kitsch has that sort of obviousness, particularly if you're on the lookout for it. It's not to say we're not vulnerable to it, but it sort of presents itself. It's quite obvious that art and artists want to flee from it. It's the ultimate ungenuineness. But it has this intrusive character and this ability to somehow enter in even to artistic practice. He cites many truly great artists and composers. He says Mahler, for example. I love Mahler, but he says Mahler is not free of it. It creeps in. He says Mahler confessed it to Freud, that he was struggling with the temptations of kitsch. There is a certain self-indulgence in Mahler, so there's perhaps something to it. So the point is that if art and the language of beauty becomes vulnerable to kitsch, of course any serious artist would begin to reject it, regardless of the various reasons. So rather than saying beauty is perceived as a religious phenomenon and modernity is hateful of religion, therefore beauty has been attacked by modernism, there's a much more compelling argument that I think Scruton gives us, which is that kitsch crept into the language of beauty and corrupted it. It turned it into an oppressive, syrupy, soft language that was the farthest thing from authentic artistic expression. So the final thought here on Scruton, from Scruton, simply because it points somehow in the direction of what we might do to offset kitsch. He thinks that kitsch is the result of no longer living under judgment. Now, in the realm of ethics, that's moral judgment. In the realm of aesthetics, it would be other types of judgment, admiration. He thinks that in a religious era, that source of judgment is still perceived as coming not only from the institutional church, but from God. And people live under the sense of divine judgment, and then they live under the mediated divine judgment in their various religious communities. He says, it is a vision that all religions deliver and all societies need. Unless we judge and are judged, the higher emotions are impossible. Pride, loyalty, self-sacrifice, tragic grief, and joyful surrender, all of these are artificial things, which exist only so long as and to the extent that we fix one another with the eye of judgment. As soon as we let go, as soon as we see one another as animals, part of the machinery of nature, released from moral imperatives and bound only by natural laws, then the higher emotions desert us. At the same time, these emotions are necessary. They endow meaning on life and form the bond of society. Hence, we find ourselves in a dangerous predicament. The emotions that we need cannot be faked. But the vision on which they depend, the vision of human freedom and of mankind as the subject and object of judgment, is constantly fading. And in these circumstances, there arrives the temptation to replace the higher life with a charade, a moral conspiracy that obscures the higher life with the steam of the herd. So, he doesn't really end this. This is a bit of an unhopeful piece. It's included in your packet. In other places, he makes his proposals, but he thinks that in the end, that artists who are aware of this risk and who live by real spiritual disciplines, he doesn't mean religious disciplines, but the disciplines that make one, that involve an acute ear or eye for kitsch and a willingness to somehow tear it out the moment it appears in an artistic work. He thinks that's the beginning of the beginning. So he mentions, we've mentioned some of these artists. He mentions contemporary poets like Rosanna Warren and Geoffrey Hill, people like Arvo Pärt. He doesn't mention Goretzky, but he mentioned them, novelists like Ian McEwan and so on. The list is probably much greater. He says, not that they are without faults, but they have retained the ability to distinguish the true from the false emotion and so offer comfort to the contrite heart. Thank you.
Two things that were brought up 2 days ago kind of remained with me as I was driving along in my pickup truck listening to country music, because there's a lot of folk lyricism there and a lot of kitsch. But I was thinking about the concept of the shocking, and we often quote, and we did quote Flannery O'Connor saying that the contemporary age needs to be shocked. Every age needs to be shocked. Every age has been sinful. It was 2,000 years ago, after all, that we murdered God. And the blindness that O'Connor wants to jolt us out of is not some kind of particularly new phenomenon. It's not about the sexual revolution. It's about hubris. And every single attempt to create a utopia over time has been hubris, and it has usually involved murdering God. I would suggest that while the crucified Christ is at the heart of our aesthetic vision and what we have to keep our focus on, what our goal is as artists or devotees of art and teachers of art is the opposite of killing God. Tolkien has this idea of all of us being like sub-creators. That's part of our imago Dei. As being creatures made in the image of God, we want to create just as God created, out of love. The other thing I want to bring up, someone asked last time, do we look closely at things? And I would say that the contemporary age is a wonderful time for looking closely at things, and I think this has just been demonstrated. We have the technology for looking closely. Sometimes what we see is extraordinary, and sometimes what we see is horrifying. I'm an organic gardener, which means I see a lot of really gross things. We need the gross things in order to live. If there is nothing gross in your soil is dead. I don't know whether you want to take this as a metaphor for art or not, but when we do look closely at nature, what we see is repeated patterns. The Fibonacci sequence, for instance, it exists on a small scale and on a large scale, and you can see that as an image for liturgy, really, that so many works of art are cyclical, but they're cyclical because they're going somewhere. If you look at James Joyce's novel Ulysses, it ends and begins in the same place, but by the end of it, the hero has been transformed. And so when we're looking at nature, then we're going to see all kinds of patterns, and some are patterns of love. The red velvet mite, for instance, those cute little tiny bugs that you see crawling around, they make little love bowers. It's part of their mating ritual. It's very sweet, as opposed to, say, the praying mantis. That's not so sweet. Or the parasitic braconid wasp, which we want in our gardens because it lays its eggs on the tomato hornworm. The eggs hatch out, the larvae burrow into the hornworm and devour it from the inside out. And thus we get a beautiful organic tomato that you too devour. Devouring becomes an image of destruction, but it's also an image of love. That's why we eat Jesus. We eat his body. And so this is one of the things we're grappling with. It's both horrible and beautiful on a large scale and on a small scale. There's a line I love from the novelist Mark Hildebrand, in which a protagonist is seeing the city of Paris burning in the war, and he says, he didn't know which was more true, that Paris, though the most beautiful city in the world, was burning, or that Paris, though burning, was the most beautiful city in the world. These are these two truths that we're trying to get at. And this is kind of, for poetry, it's this task of making connections between the unconnectable. We are trying to find meaning and order in the midst of what often seems to be chaos and contradiction. And we are also trying to, as Yeats said, articulate sweet sounds together. And both of these have to do with this idea of harmony. But in order to get there, I think there's a reason why the poets of old invoked the muse. There is the sense that Plato talks about this need of a kind of divine madness. We're very scared of that. We're very civilized people. I'm happy to question the value of certain forms of civilization, my own people having been wiped out in the millions by a very civilized nation of folks who liked Wagner, and I like Wagner too. And so civilization without the Holy Spirit is dangerous. The poets of old summoned the muse. I try to summon the Holy Spirit. This is something new I've discovered, because I realize when you are playing in that terrain of the gross, between the horrible and the glorious, there's danger there. You know, here be dragons. So I ask the Holy Spirit to guide me. And so we're then in a realm of more the ecstatic. And I experienced that sometimes, well, all right, when I was in college here, actually, I wrote 50 love sonnets to a man who did not know I was writing love sonnets to him. And the sonnets were quite bad. They were technically absolutely perfect. I think that was a necessary poetic discipline for me to go through, to learn how to manipulate the language. I don't know where the wretched things are. I don't ever want to see them. When I write now, the good work that I do, I have that sense that Plato was on to something when he talked about the divine madness, because I feel as though something is pointing me to connections between things I would not otherwise have noticed. That's how metaphor works anyway. That's how many figures of speech work. And so many poets then are aware through this kind of ecstatic experience that there is something you cannot quite put your hands on. You cannot force it into place. You cannot take a hold of beauty. Pope Benedict said in his address to young university professors, I think, that we cannot possess the truth. Freak out, people. He said we approach it, we love it, we revere it. I'm kind of paraphrasing. And I think that that's very important from a phenomenological perspective as a philosopher and also as a poet. And this is what so many poets are getting at. So I don't want to just talk about poetry, I want to read poetry. I know everyone here likes Dana Gioia, right? So here we have great poetry alive today. We have great poets alive today. Dana Gioia, do not expect. Do not expect that if your book falls open to a certain page, that any phrase you read will make a difference today, or that the voices you might overhear when the wind moves through the yellow, green, and golden tint of autumn speak to you. Things ripen or go dry. Light plays on the dark surface of the lake. Each afternoon, your shadow walks beside you on the wall, and the days stay long and heavy underneath the distant rumor of the harvest. One more summer gone. And one way or another, you survive, dull or regretful, never learning that nothing is hidden in the obvious changes of the world, that even the dim reflection of the sun on tall, dry grass is more than you will ever understand. And only briefly then you touch, you see, you press against the surface of impenetrable things. And another poem by Mary Oliver. We have two different tribes here, by the way, with these two poets. Dana Gioia speaks to a particular oikos and a particular polis, which is comfortable in white, male, Western modes of discourse, and that's fine. We work with the tools that we have at hand. Mary Oliver is a little bit more of a wild woman of the woods, so she's kind of more my tribe. Where does the dance begin? Where does it end? Don't call this world adorable or useful. That's not it. It's frisky and a theater for more than fair winds. The eyelash of lightning is neither good nor evil. The struck tree burns like a pillar of gold. But the blue rain sinks straight to the white feet of the trees whose mouths open. Doesn't the wind, turning in circles, invent the dance? Haven't the flowers moved slowly across Asia, then Europe, until at last now they shine in your own yard? Don't call this world an explanation or even an education. When the Sufi poet whirled, was he looking outward to the mountains so solidly there in a white-capped ring? Or was he looking to the center of everything, the seed, the egg, the idea that was also there, beautiful as a thumb curved and touching the finger, tenderly, little love ring, as he whirled, O jug of breath, in the garden of dust? And I think I'm just going to leave it with that pretty much, except I do want to say one last thing, and that is that where do we find poetry today? We find it, and Gioia points this out, we find it in these little enclaves and circles, and it doesn't leak out as much as it should into the everyday. And I think poetry needs to have an audience to live. And I have discovered this recently through entering into a poetic conversation with a fellow poet, also a woman, and we exchange poems back and forth. And then I've also discovered a wonderful poet, both Both of these I'm mentioning are published in our first issue of Convivium, Joanna Penn Cooper and Michael Delp. Michael Delp is the wild Michigan poet. And he has poems which he responds to the poet Jim Harrison, who was responding to the Russian poet Yesenin. And I have dared to enter into this conversation between these wild males, and I don't feel as though I'm intruding there. And I think that's something important. There are conversations that are happening, and you can enter into them. That's what the tradition is. The tradition is poets talking to one another and to our community, to our polis, to our oikos, and then this carries on into the future.